Hello, everyone. I'm Carolyn, and I offer health and healing intuitive advice for your spiritual awakening or ascension journey. And today we're going to talk about ego. Previous to this, we had a video on ego with the channel that came from the LightKeepers, really talking about what ego is and how it manifests in your life. And we have DeeDee here today. Say hi, DeeDee.
Hi.
Thank you for being with us today. We're going to talk about ego and how it's manifested how it has manifested in our spiritual awakening journey and in our lives, and we offer some tips and takeaways for our audience today. So with that, DeeDee, I'm going to read through, or I'm going to summarize the channel first of all, so then we'll start talking about it. So basically they go into really just starting out by talking about ego in general, and that it's essentially a part of who we are in humankind. And so it really talks about why must we have it, you know, and saying that it's the alternate you. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's actually a part of us being human, and therefore we can't get rid of it. It's not something to banish, and we can't do it if we wanted to. It's there along with our higher self, and we're going to talk a lot about that. So it's kind of the me part, all right? And then the channel goes into really discussing about ego. Is it evil? How does it manifest itself if it goes unchecked? You know, is it evil in the terms of how we consider evil in humankind? And essentially, what they're saying is ego in itself is not evil. It's what is unmanaged that can become destructive from the ego. And so that's really key here. And we'll talk about some examples and in our lives, and how it's really kind of either helped us along the way, because it will, because it's part of us, part of being human, and how it has really manifested in a negative way for us. And what we do with that during spiritual awakening, why it's important to actually recognize ego. Moving on to the channel, how do you know if you're operating from the perspective of your ego or not, or your higher self? Because as you're going through the spiritual awakening journey, what you're seeing, and we'll talk about this, is a shift from working in the ego state, more that human way of thinking, to moving into a more spiritually connected, working from the higher self perspective, okay? So how do you actually know which you're working from? Basically, it's the uncomfortable feelings that you get. It's that dissonance when you've done something, said something, or operated from a certain level of and way of being, and you come away and you're not completely comfortable. That's my sign, and we'll talk more about that. But again, there are degrees of this, and it's really truly a discomfort, I believe. So what do you do when you're, you know, thinking about how you're going to manage through the ego, or understand it, or even recognize it as you're going through this process of spiritual awakening? First of all, find that discomfort. If you find discomfort, essentially then you're going to know that in some way you may be operating out of your ego rather than your higher self. Recognize it, make it a part of you. Your ego's not going away. It's part of being human. And so really, again, I believe it's this idea of integrating it. Some people may not think that at all, that, you know, you need to ignore the ego and just work from your higher self. Well, I have found that for me, it really works to integrate and just know that it's part of who I am. But you got to let it know who's in charge. So with that, that's really what the channel was about. Essentially, they're saying that comfort and peace and tranquility come your way if you work all as one. And that's the channel on ego. So with that, DeeDee and I are going to talk a little bit about that, and then you'll have some takeaways after this video so you can use it in your own journey. So with that, DeeDee, I guess I'll just toss it out to you at this point, thinking about ego from the perspective of going through spiritual awakening. I guess I can say, and I said this in the video, I really never really thought about ego other than I thought it meant, before my awakening, I always thought it just meant you really thought you were big stuff. somebody's running around with a big ego, they think they got it all together, right? And so I think we've realized it's more than that.
I think it's kind of the over-identification of I or self. In that when you find yourself being judgmental or critical of someone else, it's because your ego self is holding on to something so strongly, trying to separate you and make you different, or sometimes to elevate your status. You know, we go into this ego thing because we're not feeling comfortable with ourselves. And I think a lot of the awakening process is about becoming a very authentic person. And so when you find that you're, I suppose, going against or making judgments about situations, people, and things like that, that's when I kind of tend to question myself about whether I'm functioning within my ego or whether I'm functioning within my higher self.
And I think it lines up with the idea that I had the other day that I offered to folks was, as you're going down the street, you're walking by people, think about what you see that you like about them, not that thing that we can do of judging something, be it the clothes they're wearing, the style of hair they have. I mean, I know this sounds really petty, but it happens, right?
I think that's like the very beginning of your awareness that you are being judgmental like that.
That's a really good point. So I guess, well, and I'll just use an example for myself is, well, let me back up. So you're talking about like the judgments that you have of others, right?
Right.
What I find most prevalent in my life is the judgments I have on myself.
Oh, yeah.
Well, guess what? Never thought that had anything to do with ego at all. I mean, absolutely nothing. And I'm realizing that's been my biggest issue to overcome. And I mentioned in the video about, being on the tennis, I think I did mention it about being on the tennis court, beating myself up. And I love tennis, but I would come off the court just feeling awful. And I always thought it was because I was feeling awful because maybe I didn't play well. Well, guess what? I didn't play well because I was beating myself up. So your ego can take you to a place where you cannot, I believe, even perform well because of what you're doing to yourself, beating yourself up. And I think we all do that in some manner.
Because you're busy judging yourself again.
Yeah. So
I think so much of it is about, why do we even need to have judgment? Because as far as this whole light work or awakening process, I think so much of it is about us starting to join each other, stopping being separated, and going from your ego self only tends to support us being separate from each other. Yeah. A lot of times it's our ego that's saying, I'm better than, or I'm not like that, or I don't do that, and so what we're doing is we're trying to find a way to justify.
Right. Or my way is better.
Right.
Like there aren't like 10,000 ways of doing something different. And I'm guilty of all of this. And sometimes I realize
we know this because we've lived it.
Yeah.
And continue to live it, because it isn't just a one-time thing.
No. And I'm going to tell you right now, there's some areas that I've just realized I haven't even been aware of it. And it has to do with other people. And I consider myself highly open-minded, highly accepting, but still there's all these unique differences with people in the way they think, the ideas they have. It's not, for me, it's more about, I'm just going to be really honest here. It's more about concepts and ideas.
Yes.
Not what he or she looks like or whatever, right? But it's like, lots of times I'll think, oh, well, I think I'm right. There's a lot of times in my life where I felt like I was right. Well, the other person's probably right too. It doesn't mean there's just one way of being right. To me, that's a very egocentric thing going on. And, not even being able to recognize that until now, coming into this awakening has been very interesting and kind of opened up a new perspective for me. So
Well, and I think even so much as, excuse me, good and bad. Okay.
Yeah.
Is there really good and bad? And is that more of a concept that supports our ego? Because in all actuality, everything happens to teach us something about ourselves. And if we're busy judging that, it's our ego saying, that's not happening fast enough. That's not happening the way I want it to. I think it should go this way. And that's our ego also. And I think part of not necessarily, well, I guess ultimately where we want to get to is that those kind of things don't bother us anymore. They don't make us neurotic. They don't make us have to justify our actions. We're actually able to just realize that we all are in this together, but we're also separate, and we have the right to be different than somebody else.
And to be who we want to be. Like, honestly, I've kind of gotten to this point where it's like, rules. Who said there are rules of having to be a certain way? I mean, you start looking at that differently too, because you realize so many of these rules that are in place come from an egocentric place.
Yes.
I mean, that certain ways are not appropriate of being.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't buy that anymore. It's really interesting.
I think that's really been so much of that path for me as far as the ego part. It's like, well, why do I think the things I think? Well, a lot of the things I think or that I held on to as really being who I am or what I believe or whatever were old messages, old tapes,
yes.
old culture that you're like, oh, well, in this day and age, do those things even really matter anymore?
Yes. And honestly, I think the more your ego is used, I guess I would say, against yourself,
mm-hmm.
the more likely you're likely projecting that out, your ego out to others as well. So my thought is if you start working on yourself and how your ego, how you're speaking to really kind of speaking to yourself, okay? Mm-hmm. You're speaking to yourself and you get that cleared up, or you're improving upon that, that's going to reflect out to how you feel about others and how you behave towards others as mm-hmm. well. The judgments mm-hmm. that you have or don't have. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, that's going to clean itself up, I think, as you clean yourself up with respect to how your ego treats yourself.
Well, I think
that makes any sense.
No, it does completely. And I think what we do so many things out of having to justify ourselves. Mm-hmm. And I think when you start to let that judgment go of self and of others, you realize it's really your ego that's there trying to make you justify why you feel the way that you feel. And all of a sudden, I think when you start to do it to yourself, you realize it doesn't matter. And then you can extend it to other people and realize that they have every right to have their own opinion.
Right.
And I think you also...
And their way of living, as long as it's not harming someone else.
And I think you also tend to look at also, or I did, I guess that's all I can talk about, is was I doing things or saying things or acting out of an attempt to manipulate someone by forcing my opinion onto them or making my opinion more important?
Yes.
And so it's like you realize you don't have to do that anymore. So there's less defensiveness. There's less need to argue because everybody has the right.
Listen better.
You listen so much better because that's just their truth.
Yeah. I mean, I think in my life, I've realized one of the things I've always wanted to work on more is listening and hearing the other person, not just not talking, but listening. I think for me, not listening and talking over people at times, that comes maybe from an ego perspective. So I think this awakening really opens up this whole way of thinking about things, one of which is ego. And so I want to kind of move to a different piece of this, talking about like an out of control ego. So I'm going to go back to my example of I'm on the tennis court, I bash myself, I have a lousy game, and I walk away and I wonder why, and I feel horrible. I've done this over and over and over again. Well, let's just take that into your whole life. Say that's how you are ultimately with yourself. regular, constantly beat down, beat down, beat down. And that's your ego doing that, right? So what ultimately could come out of a really uncontrolled ego? Now, I think in my example there, I just used the kind of the opposite of what can be a out of control ego that we typically think of in society, which is the I'm the best, I'm awesome, I'm running the world, it's my way or the highway kind of ego. So there's two things going on here, I think. Do you know what I'm saying?
Very much so.
Or two ways of being with your ego, but I think they're interrelated. So any thoughts on that? I mean, when we look at out of control egos, I'm just going to throw out some ideas for you to chew on. Not to name any politicians in particular, because
seems to be pretty universal.
Well, kind of is, or yeah, not maybe taking into account other perspectives, or just moving in the direction they think is the right way to go. I mean, and it's that all power thing. I think when we see those all powerful, and there are many other examples other than just politicians, but
I think it's when somebody is trying to run everything through self. It's like, how does that affect me? What does that mean to me?
It's that
as opposed to thinking about in a much more collective way.
Right.
When you're working with your higher self, as opposed to your ego, is this good for everybody involved? Is this the highest and best for everyone?
Looking outside of yourself. Yes. So,
and that's something we don't, or we're feeling like we're not getting with our politicians at this point, because of a culture of kind of, it seems like, trying to fill their own needs, which is what we're saying. Well, we're trying to teach ourselves how to not be that way.
Right. Right. And they're just one example of many, but that's a really, I think, good example of the two ways I think ego manifests itself. There are probably multiple ways, but one of which people get beaten down so badly that they feel worthless, and they're essentially doing it to their self, okay, or contributing a lot. Then you see the other side of that, where it's about I'm all powerful and everything I do is right, is the way to go. And so you get this.
And it's got to be somewhere in between the two of those.
Well, and that's exactly it. But the thing is, to me, with what this spiritual awakening does, all of a sudden you have this concept of a higher self. Well, I always kind of knew I had a soul. Never thought about it in a million years. Just that, I'm going to die someday and I'm going to go to heaven. I mean, what does that mean? But your soul is, your higher self is in operation all the time. But if you're working from your ego construct all the time, every day, does your higher self ever have a chance to say anything? Maybe that little whisper? So spiritual awakening, what I think is so wonderful about this process is, here's your ego, here's higher self, typically in our human world. All of a sudden, you're seeing this thing like this happen, okay? And then, here's what I think is interesting, is when it gets right about here, then you start seeing this, like, you can struggle. It's like, and it's, I don't want to say it's a fight, but you could offer it up as a fight to, like, there, you do hear some people say, get rid of the ego. Well, in my estimation, and what I've seen is, you do want it like this, I think, with where higher self's here. But the thing is, this is still going to blend in. You're going to blend in the ego, and you're going to continue to have the ego work. But if you always say your higher self is in charge, and you start recognizing what your higher self is versus what your ego is, I think you're going to see a dramatic change.
I think running things through your higher self makes you question, why am I doing the things that I'm doing? Makes you look at your intent and your authenticity.
Yes.
And why you're doing the things that you're doing. Whereas when you were functioning from a more egoic state, it was always about what you needed. Now your higher self is trying to pull it all together to make it fit and work with everyone else in a more peaceful environment for yourself, with other people.
Right. And I think that leads to the part in the channel that they talk about where how do you even know what you're operating from? How are you going to know if your ego is, I guess I would say, manipulating you or running the show? Well, they talk about discomfort. And I thought, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense. The dissonance between, like, you feel icky.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's just the best way for me to put it.
Mm-hmm.
And I keep going back to the tennis court example, but it's a great example.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I feel icky. That is one of my favorite things to do. But I'll come off the court and just feel lousy. That's changed up since my spiritual awakening, because that was the last bastion for me of the ego. And it feels so different now when I go out and play, because I'm not letting myself bash myself, because why does that matter anyway? So I think, I don't know, do you want to just kind of comment a bit on like how you, or what you see with others, how we would notice that your ego is kind of running the show?
I think I can really talk more about my own journey. Okay. Yeah. When I get defensive, and this is one of the things that I noticed early on, is when I felt a need to defend my position or why something somebody said to me made me question my work. And I think that's that, lower level of it. Okay. Then I would say to myself, what you do is you get your back up and then you get defensive about things, and you're trying to support that ego because you're not understanding that angst you're feeling between, why do I have this uncomfortable feeling when somebody triggered something inside of me? And so what I've been trying to do over the last few years is just ask myself, what is that uncomfortable feeling? Why am I feeling that uncomfortable feeling? What does it have to do with? And it's interesting to me that so much of it has to do with old messages, old patterns, old things people have said to you, that inner child kind of work that you need to look at, and why you're even doubting yourself in the first place.
Yeah, and I think where you really come into your power with what you just said is, in the examples you used, is as that thing is happening, like say that defensiveness, yet the other part of you is recognizing it, going, what are you doing? Mm-hmm. What are you doing? Whereas so much of our life has been spent just reacting and doing that, not being able to be there and go, here's higher self, here's ego, going, what are you doing? What are you doing? I mean, to be able to recognize that, like you just said, is so powerful.
And it actually does become easier.
Yeah.
Once you start doing it, you realize, oh gosh, there's that uncomfortable feeling again. Why am I having to defend myself to myself? Or why do I have to live with these shoulds? Or why do I, like, somebody said something that makes me feel it doesn't even have, maybe the sentence wasn't even about you, but it brings up something within you. It becomes easier the more that you practice it and the more that you realize. And eventually, I think there's less, because you've paid attention to it and you've sort of, and it's never going to go away, but you realize where you're functioning from.
Yes.
And that you don't need to defend yourself. You don't need to hold this rigid standard of shoulds or perfectionism or whatever. Then you realize that if you're functioning within your higher self, all that stuff doesn't really matter.
No. But I think you really hit a couple things I was going to comment on that you said was the more you practice it. Because I think it's just like anything else. It's like getting good at an activity that you've never done before. You got to keep doing it, right? And then eventually it's going to be more, you're going to be more aware of each time you make a judgment on somebody, or you
should yourself.
Beat yourself down. Right. You should yourself. Yes, I like that. And so, becoming more aware of that is part of this spiritual awakening journey. And it is so,
well, because I think it starts to go on I suppose simultaneously with you going to that uncomfortable spot eventually.
Right.
Whereas before, I guess when I was first starting to awaken to it, you'd go away and you'd be like repeating whatever somebody said to you, or you'd be perseverating on your own ideas. And I don't do that so much anymore because
Exactly.
I recognize that, oh, that bothered me. Why did that bother me?
And
Take it back to the core. And really and truly, I think in part of that is just observing your own self, observing yourself.
Yes. And bottom line, I think it's greater acceptance of yourself and others. I mean,
oh, completely. And you know what? Would that not cure a lot of our ills we have in the world right now, is allowing everybody to be their authentic self and not judging them?
And then, right, exactly. And I know too, self-talk, so many people, I'm one of them, self-talk is something that I've overcome pretty readily during the awakening process, where, you know, the beat down of yourself, saying things like I literally would, like I'd drop something, I don't know, say something on the kitchen floor and I'd say, oh, that was stupid. I mean, really? I mean,
you wouldn't talk like that to anybody else, right?
No, but I did it a lot. And then I started recognizing it mainly because somebody mentioned it to me once. Nobody had ever said that to me before. I'm sure I'd done it my whole life. And I was like, oh, that's not good self-talk. I mean, that's your ego beating you down every day, even over something little. I'm sure I did it all the time. Look in the mirror and go, God, I hate my hair today, or, you know, I look awful. That's not appropriate for treating yourself well. So anyway, I think, is there anything else you want to talk about? With
let me see. I kind of wrote a couple notes. Let me just look real separate.
And I will say, I think one thing too that I have found with respect to ego and really like reclaiming myself is I'm a kinder, gentler person primarily. I mean, I think I typically have been to others, but it's mainly myself. And I have honestly found greater peace as a result. And it is a practice thing. It is not going to happen overnight.
Well, I think sometimes when you're in that egoic state, you're not willing to explore or go into new realities because you're so heavily invested in your stance. And as you start to let a lot of this, my mom made the meatloaf in a square instead of a circle or whatever silly thing. Yeah. You know, it's like, why am I doing that? Well, because that's how she did things. And we start to question things. And as we start to look at why are we doing some of the things, and I think really what we're talking about here is living a more conscious life. Exactly. And that's really how you work within the ego, is living a more conscious life. Then you're actually able to enter into new realities because you're not so invested in keeping everything that you thought to be true before true. Because I mean, it's like holding it, is trying to keep things the way they were. And this is such an ever-changing day-to-day thing as you're awakening, that you're not going to be as open to these new changes and the new ideas of thought because you're so invested in things being the way they were that you can trust in. Well, and that's not what it's about anymore. It's about opening up to the possibilities.
Exactly. And I think too, kind of to start wrapping this up, I think this can become it's interesting. This can become more of a struggle because also our emotions during spiritual awakening can go up and down and up and down. So you can get like a more drastic, more drastic range of what the ego is going to do during that journey. Because ultimately, you can consider it another thing, but it's a part of you, right? It is a part of you.
And it's never going to go away.
No, it's part of being human. So accept that.
I think it does point to things. You know what I mean? It helps us.
Yes, it's not like somebody inserted an alien body into us and that's called the ego. It's part of humanity. So we just got to learn to work with it. And honestly, I think accept it, but make sure that ultimately down the road that you're learning to work from your higher self. And again, that comes with complete experience, and that's part of this journey. So with that, I think we'll wrap this up. Do you want to say goodbye, DeeDee?
Sure. Bye, everybody.
All right. Thank you today for joining us.
Thanks, Carolyn.
We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.